"See that she receives it," said Fenwick, Duke of Atherhall, laying the sealed letter upon the salver as though it were something soiled, "and see that she reads to the end. I would have her know precisely what she is summoned to witness." The steward's hand hovered above the paper. He was a careful old man named Brumwell who had served the house through 2 dukes and had learned in that long service exactly when to hold his tongue, yet even Brumwell allowed himself the smallest pause, the smallest lift of grey brows, before his fingers closed about the letter and it vanished into his coat. "To the very end, your grace," he said. "To the very end." The Duke turned back toward the tall windows of the long gallery, where the November light lay thin and colourless across the parquet, and clasped his hands behind him, and did not look at the man again. He had said what wanted saying. He had thought about it a great deal in the cold hours he no longer spent asleep, and he had decided that a discourtesy was not enough, that mere silence was not enough, that after everything only her presence would do. She would come. Whatever else might be said of Corenza Sedley, she had never in her life refused a summons she believed herself bound to answer, and he was counting upon that as a man counts upon the sun to rise, with no gratitude and no doubt. He heard the door close. He was alone with the portraits then, rows of Atherhalls in their dark frames looking down their painted noses at him, and he suffered them to look. They had all of them, he supposed, made their bargains and buried their private ruins and gone on ruling this corner of the county with the same unbending face he wore now. He was 36 and he had ruled it for 11 years, since the fever took his father in a single week and left him a dukedom, a mountain of debt long since conquered, and a reputation that walked ahead of him into every room he entered. Men called him hard. They were not wrong. He had made himself hard on purpose, plank by plank, the way a man boards up a house he does not intend to live in again, and if the county whispered that the Duke of Atherhall had no heart, then the county had understood him better than it knew. There had been one door in that boarded house left ajar once. He had closed it himself. He intended in 11 days' time to nail it shut before 400 guests and be done with the draught that had troubled him these 7 years. The wedding would be the grandest the district had seen in a generation. He had willed it so. Every family of consequence for 40 miles had received their gilt-edged card. The London confectioners were engaged, the chapel was being dressed with hothouse white, and his intended bride, Miss Lucasta Trevithick, had spoken to him 3 times already of the precise shade of the awnings, as though the fate of nations turned upon it. She was handsome, Lucasta, handsome in the bright hard way of a well-cut gem, and she was clever, and she was the daughter of a viscount whose lands marched with his own along the whole eastern boundary. It was, everyone agreed, an excellent match. It joined 2 great houses. It answered every question that could sensibly be asked of a duke's second marriage. Fenwick had proposed it himself in a drawing-room, in the space of 4 dry sentences, and had felt precisely nothing as he did so, and had counted that nothing a mercy. He did not love her. He had told her as much in gentler words, and she had smiled and said that love was a thing for milkmaids and poets, and that she preferred an understanding, and he had thought at the time that they should get on tolerably well together. 2 people who wanted nothing of one another beyond the terms of the contract could not easily wound one another. He had learned what wounding cost. He did not mean to pay it twice. That was the whole shape of the man he had made himself, and he had grown comfortable inside it the way a soldier grows comfortable inside old armor, scarcely feeling the weight. His days had a cold order to them. He rose before the household, rode the boundaries of his own land in all weathers, sat with his agents over rents and drains and the endless small wars of a great estate, and dined alone more often than not, with a book propped against the decanter and no voice in the room but his own when he chose to use it. He was respected, he was obeyed. He was by every measure the county owned a fortunate man, if there were hours, grey hours, near dawn, when the order of it all felt less like a fortress than a very long and very handsome imprisonment. He did not speak of them, and he had trained himself, mostly, not to notice them either. A footfall behind him, light and quick, and then the rustle of a great deal of silk. He did not turn. "There you are, brooding among your ancestors," said Lucasta, coming to stand beside him at the window, close enough that he caught the cold rose scent of her. "Cousin Adela swears you mean to receive the whole county in this dreadful gallery." I have told her it is far too long and far too dim, and that we shall open the south rooms instead. You do not object?" "I do not object," said the Duke. "I never suppose you will." She said it lightly, but her eyes, when he glanced down at her, were watching him with a bright, unresting attention that missed very little. "There is a rumour abroad, Fenwick, a curious one. My father had it from Lady Merion, who had it from her sister, who is forever wrong about everything and so is likely for once to be right." She let the pause hang. "They say you have sent a card to the Sedley woman." So it was already running. He had known it would. He had, in truth, half wished it to. "I have sent a card," he said, "to a great many people. To her." Lucasta's mouth curved. "To the little draggle-tailed nobody your father married you off to when you were scarcely a man and could not stop him. The one who was sent away." She laughed, a small polished sound like a coin dropped on marble. "Whatever can you mean by it? One does not invite one's discarded first wife to one's wedding, my dear. It is not done. It is not even amusing. Well, perhaps it is a little amusing." "She was never my wife," said Fenwick, and heard how flat his own voice had gone. "The marriage was set aside. You know this. The whole county knows this. There was a settlement upon her people, and she was removed, and that was the end of it. Then why summon her?" He looked out at the bare park, at the avenue of limes stripped down to their black bones, at the long grey drive that ran out toward the world. 7 years. She would be 24 now, or near it. He wondered and despised himself for wondering what 7 years of the life he had bought her had made of her face. "Because," he said, "I should like her to see it, all of it. The chapel and the 400 guests and the joining of 2 great houses, and to understand at last what she was weighed against and found wanting. She was given a duke and she made him a laughing-stock, and she was sent off with a purse and never so much as a word of contrition. I mean her to stand in that chapel and watch me marry a woman worthy of the name Atherhall. I mean it to be the last thing she carries away from this house." He drew a slow breath. "That is why I summon her. Call it a cruelty if you like. I have been called worse and for less." Lucasta was quiet a moment. Then she slid her gloved hand through his arm and pressed it, and there was in the gesture a real pleasure, warmer and franker than any she had shown him over the awnings. "Do you know," she murmured, "I believe I shall enjoy our wedding a great deal more than I had thought. How delicious of you, Fenwick. I had taken you for a cold man. I did not know you could be a vengeful one." "They are nearer than you would think," said the Duke, and drew his arm free gently, and left her at the window. He should have felt some satisfaction in it. He had rehearsed the feeling. He had built the whole design toward it, this slow public reckoning 7 years in the coming. Instead, as he walked the length of the gallery with his heels ringing on the parquet and the painted Atherhalls sliding by, he felt only the old cold thing turning over in his chest like a stone at the bottom of a well. And the memory he had spent 7 years boarding over came up through the planks as it always did, unbidden and entire. He had been 19. She had been 16, a parson's orphan, portionless, raised in the household of his father's steward, a slight quiet creature with ink on her fingers, and a way of looking at a person as though she saw straight through the coat and the name to whatever poor honest thing was underneath. His father had arranged it in an afternoon, for reasons of his own that Fenwick had been too young and too proud to question, some debt of conscience to her dead father, some scheme to bind the steward's loyalty, some whim. It did not signify now. What signified was that the boy Fenwick had gone to that marriage sullen and resentful, resolved to despise the girl chosen for him, and had found instead, in the long green summer of it, that he could not, that she was kind past his deserving, that she laughed at his gravity and was not afraid of him and read to him in the orchard from books he had never troubled to open, and that somewhere between the wedding and the first frost he had fallen into loving her with the whole undefended heart of a boy who did not yet know what love could be made to cost. And then the letters. Then his father's face, grey and terrible, and the packet of paper laid before him on the library table, and the words in a hand he knew, a hand, that neat slanting hand, arranging a flight, a meeting, a sum of money, with a man whose name Fenwick had never afterward been able to say aloud. He had not spoken to her. That was the part he could not, even now, hold steady in his mind, that he had not gone to her, had not put the letters in her hands and demanded she answer them, had not given her so much as the hour it would have taken to lie to him. He had been 19 and drowning, and his father had said, "This is what they are, boy, the low-born, they take your name and your bed and they sell you the moment a better offer comes." And Fenwick had let his father sweep her out of the house before the week was through, and had signed what was set before him to sign, and had built the boarded house around the ruin of that summer and lived in it ever since. He had never once let himself wonder whether the letters were true. To wonder was to open the door, and behind the door was a cold that would kill him. So he had made her a villain, because a villain could be hated, and a man could go on living inside his hatred as inside a warm coat, whereas a man who had cast out an innocent for a lie had nothing to go on living inside at all. She would come to the wedding, and he would look at her across the chapel, and he would feel the hatred fresh and clean, and that would prove, once and for all, that he had been right. That was the design. He was almost certain of it. The days went by. The house filled. Carriages came grinding up the long drive with their loads of gentry and boxes and ladies' maids. The great rooms were thrown open one by one and dressed in white and silver. The chapel filled with the sweet oppressive smell of hothouse lilies until a man could scarcely breathe in it. Lucasta ruled over all of it with her bright hard competence, and her mother the Viscountess ruled over Lucasta, and Fenwick moved through the swelling noise of his own wedding like a man moving through a fever, saying what was required, signing what was set before him, and waiting. Though he would not have named it waiting, for one particular carriage that did not come. He found himself in those crowded days doing a thing he had not done in years. He would be crossing the great hall, or standing at a window with some tedious guest recounting some tedious triumph, and his eye would go of its own accord to the long grey drive beyond the limes, searching it the length of its run to the distant gate, before he caught himself and looked sharply away. It was watchfulness, he told himself. A general does not scorn to know from which quarter his enemy will come. That the watching had a quality in it he did not care to examine, a tightness low in the chest, a lifting and then a falling each time the drive proved empty. He laid to the account of the general strain of the house, and thought no more of it, and looked again 10 minutes later. It did not come the day before the wedding, when the last of the guests arrived and the house blazed with candles till past midnight. It did not come on the morning itself, through all the long bright bustle of the dressing, and the arriving and the settling of 400 people into the pews and the aisles and the gallery of the great chapel. He stood at the head of it in his wedding clothes with the bishop at his elbow and Lucasta, column of white lace, beside him, and the organ breathing, and the whole glittering county turned in their seats to watch him, and he told himself the cold thing in his chest was triumph. She had not dared. She had taken his purse 7 years ago, and she would take his contempt now from a safe distance, and never show her face, and that too was an answer, and a fitting one. He fixed his eyes upon the altar and set his jaw and waited for the bishop to begin. The organ faltered. It was a small thing, a breath's hesitation in the great swelling chord, but Fenwick heard it and heard the sound that followed it, the vast soft rustle of 400 people turning all at once toward the west door, and against every intention of his he turned with them. She stood in the open doorway with the grey daylight behind her, and for one endless moment the whole crowded blazing chapel went silent and still, so that he could hear the guttering of the nearest candles and the blood in his own ears. He had prepared himself for a draggled woman. He had built the whole design upon it, upon a worn, cowed, shabby creature who would shuffle to a back pew and shrink there under the weight of his revenge. The woman in the doorway was none of these things. She was dressed plainly, yes, in dark travelling grey without an ornament upon it, and beside Lucasta's foaming lace she looked as a plover looks beside a peacock. But she stood straight as a young birch, and she was not shrinking, and she was not afraid. She had grown into her face in the 7 years. It was a still, grave, lovely face, older than her years about the eyes, and it was turned up the length of the chapel directly toward him with an expression he could not read and could not look away from, not defiance, not pleading, not the contrition he had summoned her here to offer. Something quieter and far more terrible than any of these, something that looked, God help him, like sorrow and a settled, unshakable purpose, and underneath both, banked low, a thing that might almost have been pity. and she was not alone. Half hidden in the grey folds of her skirt, one small hand gripping the dark cloth, stood a child, a boy. He could not have been above 6 years old, dark-headed, straight-backed, looking up the aisle at all the staring faces with a grave composure that sat strangely upon so small a frame. A composure Fenwick knew, a composure he saw every morning in his own glass, in the set of a jaw and the line of a brow that had come down through the painted Atherhalls in their dark frames for 300 years. The Duke of Atherhall stood at the altar of his second wedding with 400 guests holding their breath around him, and felt the boarded house he had lived in for 7 years shudder to its foundations, and could not have said one word to save his soul. She began to walk toward him up the long white aisle, the child's hand in hers, unhurried, her eyes never leaving his face. And somewhere behind him he heard Lucas draw a sharp, bright breath and heard it catch and go still. She came up the aisle the way water comes, without haste and without any possibility of being turned back. Fenwick had seen men walk to the block with less composure. Every eye in the chapel followed her, 400 faces swivelling in the candlelight, and she seemed to feel none of them. She looked only at him, up the length of that white river of a carpet, with the child's hand fast in hers and her chin level and her plain grey skirts whispering against the pew ends. He had commanded this. He had written the letter with his own hand and sealed it and bid Bramwell see that she read it to the very end. And he had imagined this 100 times in the cold hours, her coming, her small figure diminished by the grandeur of it all, her eyes cast down. He had not imagined that she would come like a queen into a country that had exiled her. He had not imagined the boy. Above all, he had not imagined that his own heart, that boarded and shuttered thing he had trusted these 7 years to feel nothing, would begin to knock against his ribs like a fist upon a door. He was aware of the bishop at his shoulder, gone rigid, the great gilt-edged book half open in his hands. He was aware of Lucasta beside him, of the whole white column of her held very still, and of the small dangerous sound she had made and swallowed. He was aware of her mother, the Viscountess, somewhere in the front pew, of a rising murmur beginning far back beneath the gallery and running forward through the crowd like wind through standing corn. All of it reached him from a great distance, muffled, as though he stood at the bottom of the well, and these were only the far voices of the world above. What was near, what was terribly, unbearably near, was Corenza Sedley, who had stopped now within 10 feet of him at the very edge of the altar's steps, and who stood looking up at him in his wedding clothes with that grave, still sorrow in her face, and said nothing at all, was for him to speak. He knew it, and could not find the shape of a single word. He had prepared a great armoury of them, cold courtesies honed to cut. The whole cool, contemptuous speech he had meant to deliver across the chapel to break her before the county. Every blade of it had gone from his hands. He stood mute at the altar of his own wedding, a duke before 400 of his people, and it was the discarded woman who at last, quietly, gave him back his voice by using her own. "You summon me, your grace," she said. Her tone was low and even, and it carried no further than the front pews, and there was in it neither the tremor of the suppliant nor the edge of the accuser. "I have come. I am sorry to have come late, and sorry to have come so. The roads from the coast are ill in November, and I would not risk the child by driving through the dark." She let that settle a moment, the fact of the child, without gesturing to him, without displaying him. "You wished me to see this. I am here to see it. But I find I must ask something of you first, and I would ask it of you alone. Alone." He heard the word come out of himself hoarse and strange. "Alone," she said. "Not here. Not before all these good people who have come so far to watch you married." A faint colour touched cheek, but her eyes did not waver. "What I have to say to you is not for them. It was never for them. It has waited 7 years to be said, and it can wait another quarter of an hour, if you will grant me the quarter of an hour. And if you will not," her hand tightened, he saw, upon the child's, "then I will turn about and take the road back to the coast, and trouble your house no further while I live, and you may marry your lady and think of me what you have always chosen to think. I leave the choosing to you. I have learned it is yours to do." There was no reproach in the last of it, or none that a stranger would have heard, and yet it went into him like a needle slid clean between the ribs, so fine he scarcely felt the entering and could not afterward pull it free. "It was yours to do." She had said it as one states a plain fact of the weather. He had chosen 7 years past without a word to her, without an hour given her to answer, and she had lived every day since inside that choosing, and she stood before him now and named it and laid no blame upon it, and the not blaming was worse than any blow she could have struck. He had built her, plank by plank, into a creature who schemed and betrayed and took a duke's purse without a backward glance. The woman on the steps had taken nothing from him but a summons, and stood there offering him, of all the impossible things, mercy, the chance to hear in private what she might have flung in his face before them all. Fenwick, Lucasta's voice close at his ear, bright and low and shaking with a fury held hard under polish. Fenwick, you cannot mean to entertain this. The creature has walked into your wedding off the public road with some beggar's brat by the hand and a tale ready made, and half the county witness to it. Send her out this instant, and let the bishop go on, or by heaven she will have exactly what she came for. He did not answer Lucasta. He was looking at the child. The boy had not once looked away from him. All this while, through the whispering and the candle smoke, and his mother's quiet terrible speech. The child had stood at her side with his small hand swallowed in hers and his dark head tipped back, and had studied the Duke of Atherhall with a frank grave attention that no boy of 6 had any business owning. It was not fear. It was not the awed gaping of a cottage child brought up sudden against a great man in his glory. It was a kind of careful searching, as though the boy too were reading a coat and a name to find whatever poor honest thing lay under them, and Fenwick, meeting it, felt the ground of the chapel tilt beneath his polished shoes, the set of that small jaw, the line of the brow dark and straight and a little frowning, the Atherhall chin that had come scowling down through 3 centuries of dark-framed portraits in the long gallery, that he had seen not an hour since in his own glass while his man tied his stock. It looked up at him now out of a child's soft face, unmistakable, and did the arithmetic he had not yet dared to do. 7 years. She had been sent from this house 7 years since, in the last week of a green summer, with a purse and a closed carriage, and not one word from the boy he had been. And the child at her side was not above 6. The murmur of the crowd rose and fell. The bishop cleared his throat unhappily. Somewhere a woman tittered and was hushed. Fenwick heard none of it. He was falling very slowly, down the length of that small grave face, and there was no bottom to the fall that he could find. For 7 years he had refused himself one question, the way a man dying of thirst refuses himself the salt water that will kill him faster. He had never let himself wonder whether the letters were true. To wonder was to open the door, and behind the door was a cold that would end him, and so he had nailed it shut and hated her instead, because hatred was a warm coat and a man might live inside it, but a man cannot hate a child. The plain fact of the boy stood in the aisle beyond the reach of any story Fenwick had told himself, outside the whole boarded house of his grievance, and it asked the forbidden question for him whether he or no, if she had been the low, scheming creature his father named her. The woman who sold her duke the moment a better offer came then, whose was the boy with the Atherhall scowl, got and carried and raised in poverty on the far coast these 6 years, and brought home now not to any advantage he could name, but into the very jaws of his revenge. It answered nothing, and it unmade everything. He felt the cold of the open door move over him, and did not, this once, step back from it. His name, said the Duke, and did not know he meant to say it until it was said. What is the boy called? Something moved across Corenza's face then. Swift and deep, the first crack in the great stillness she had held since the doorway pane, and a kind of fierce protectiveness, and under both a grief so old and worn smooth that had long since stopped looking like grief, and had become only the shape of her. She drew the child a half-step nearer to her skirts, as though even the question might bruise him. Not here, she said again, very softly. I beg you, not before all these. Grant me the quarter of an hour, Fenwick, and I will tell you everything you ask, and answer for all of it, and then I will go. But not his name, not like this, not with them all leaning to hear it. He is a little boy. He has done no wrong to any soul in this room. Whatever you owe me, or think I owe you, give him this much. Let it be said in a quiet room, between the 2 of us that it concerns, and not made a spectacle of before your guests. And that undid him more than the boy had. He had come to this chapel to make a spectacle of her. The whole vast machine of the day, the 400 cards and the London confectioners and the hothouse lilies choking the air, all of it had been built for no other end than to set her small and shamed before the county and grind 7 years of imagined injury into her face. She knew it. She had read his letter to the very end, as he had bidden. She had walked into the trap open-eyed, with her child by the hand, and the first thing she asked of the man who had laid it was not for herself. It was that he spare the boy the spectacle. She stood in the pit he had dug and thought first of shielding a child from the fall. Your Grace. The bishop had gathered himself. He leaned in, murmuring, his old face creased with the particular distress of a churchman who feels a sacrament slipping between his fingers. This is most irregular. Most irregular. The whole assembly, if it please your Grace, I might proceed, and that the lady might be conducted to withdraw, and any matter of business be taken up at a fitter. No, said Fenwick. The word fell into the chapel like a dropped stone into a still pond, and the ripples of it ran outward visibly, pew by pew, until even the gallery had gone silent. He heard Lucasta's indrawn breath, sharp as a struck match. He did not turn to her. He was looking at Corenza, and he found that having said the one word he could not now unsay it, nor did he wish to. Something had come loose in the boarded house of him. Some plank sprung at last from its nails, and through the gap came a cold, clean air that was half terror, and half he had no name for the other half. He had not felt it in 7 years. He was not sure he had ever felt it. There is a room, he said, and was faintly astonished at how level his own voice came, behind the altar, the vestry. It is private. He turned then, and looked for the first time full at Lucasta, at the handsome bright face gone white and rigid with the affront of it, at the Viscountess half risen from the front pew with her fan snapped shut in her fist. You will forgive me, he said to them, and to all of them, to the whole staring county turned in their seats. There is a matter I must satisfy myself upon before I am married. I will not be long. Let no one leave. Fenwick. Lucasta's hand closed upon his sleeve, and her voice had dropped to a fierce whisper that shook. If you walk into that room with her, you make a fool of me before every family in the county. My father is in this chapel. My mother. You will not do it. You cannot be so lost to yourself as to. She checked and mastered it, and when she spoke again she was back over the fury, hard and bright as glaze fired over a crack. It is a trick, my dear, a common woman's trick played for money or for spite or for the pleasure of the ruin. Any child may be got and carried into a church and made to stand and stare. Do not be soft, it is beneath the name you bear. He looked down at her gloved hand upon his arm, at the pearls and the foaming lace, at the cold rose scent of her that he had never once in all their engagement wished to draw nearer to, and he thought, with a clarity that frightened him, that she was very possibly right, that it might indeed be a trick, that a wiser and harder man would put the woman out of doors and go on with his excellent match, that he was going to walk into the vestry all the same, because he would sooner die at the altar than let the bishop begin one word of the service with that question unanswered, and that small grave face burning a hole through the back of his skull. He drew his arm free of Lucasta's hand, gently, as he had drawn it free in the gallery 11 days before. If it is a trick, he said, then I shall know it within the quarter of an hour, and put them both from the house, and come back and be married, and you shall have had your triumph the sweeter for the waiting. And if it is not, he did not finish it. He could not finish it. He turned from her white face before she could see whatever showed in his own. He came down the altar steps. It was 3 steps only, and he had stood upon that days 100 times in his life, at christenings and burials of his own blood, and yet the coming down of those 3 steps felt like the crossing of a border out of one country of his life and into another with no road back. He stopped before Corenza Sedley on the level of the aisle, near enough now to see what the distance had hidden the fine lines the 7 years had drawn at the corners of her eyes, the roughened knuckle of a hand that had learned to work, the darn neat and honest at the wrist of her grey glove, near enough to see that she was not the girl of 16 who had read to him in the orchard, ink on her fingers, laughing at his gravity. That girl was gone, spent into this grave still woman who had raised a child alone on the far coast on a purse of his contempt, and who stood now within arm's reach of him with her eyes lifted to his and something behind them that trembled, for the first time, on the edge of breaking. The vestry, he said to her, low for her alone. Come, bring, his voice failed on it. Bring the boy. Thank you, she said. Only that. And there was more feeling packed into those two small words, more of a long-held breath let carefully out, than in any speech she might have made. She did not smile. She did not lay her free hand upon his sleeve as Lucasta had, did not press or plead or seize the advantage he had given her. She only inclined her head once, with a dignity that put every jeweled woman in that chapel to shame, and turned the child gently by the shoulder, and made ready to follow where the Duke should lead. And the boy, being turned, looked up once more into Fenwick's face, that searching, careful, unafraid look, so like and so unbearably unlike the look Fenwick gave the glass each morning, and said, in a clear high child's voice that carried further in the hush than any of them had spoken, "Are you the man, then, the man mother lights the candle for?" Corenza went very white. Her hand flew to the child's shoulder. "Hush now, Jory," she breathed. "Hush." But the words were out, and they hung in the smoky candlelit air of the chapel, and would not be taken back. The man mother lights the candle for, and Fenwick, standing frozen at the foot of his own altar with his second bride white and furious behind him, and 400 of his people holding their breath, felt the whole boarded house of 7 years give one last shudder and come silently down about his ears. He had summoned her here to prove himself right. He had wanted only to let her once across the chapel and feel the old hatred fresh and clean and be delivered by it, and he stood now unable to summon so much as its shadow, unable to look away from her, certain of nothing in all the world save that whatever waited behind the vestry door, he had to hear it, though it cost him the wedding and the county and the last hard plank of the man he had spent 7 years making himself into. He put out his hand toward the little door behind the altar, and found that it was not steady, and led them from the aisle. The vows had not been spoken. He had halted them with 3 low words to the bishop and a lift of his hand that the whole chapel understood at once. And now the great glittering company that had assembled to see the Duke of Atherhall married was pouring instead into the south rooms in a slow bright tide of scandal. 400 people who had been promised one spectacle and given, without paying a farthing more, a far richer one. Fenwick walked at the head of them, because there was nothing else a man in his place could do, and because to have fled to his own apartments would have been to hand the whole county its story ready-made. So he walked and smiled at no one, and felt the eyes crawling over his back like flies, and did not once permit himself to look for the grey figure he knew to be somewhere in the press behind him with a child's hand fast in hers. He had ordered wine. He heard himself order it, heard his own voice come out level and cold and reasonable, and marvelled dimly that it should, for inside the boarded house something had come off its hinges and was swinging in a wind he could not stop. The footmen moved among the crush with their trays. The Viscountess, Lucasta's mother, had planted herself by the great fire, with 2 spots of high colour burning on her cheekbones, and was saying to everyone within reach that it was a disgrace and outrage that such a creature should be suffered to cross the threshold on such a day, and that of course the wedding would go forward the moment this impertinence had been swept from the house. And Lucasta had recovered herself. That was the thing he watched, against his will from his place near the tall windows, how quickly she recovered. The sharp bright breath she had drawn at the altar was mastered inside a minute. By the time she had reached the south drawing-room, she had put on her composure again, as smoothly as she put on her gloves, and there was even a kind of relish waking in a hard, handsome face. For here was a stage set precisely to her measure and an audience 300 strong. She had asked for a wedding she might enjoy. She meant, he saw, to enjoy this instead. "Bring her here," Lucasta said, not loudly, but into one of those hushes that fall upon a crowded room by accident, so that the words carried to the walls. "Do not let her lurk by the door like a servant hoping to be overlooked. If she has come all this way to be looked at, she shall be looked at. Cousin Adela, be so good." He might have stopped it there. He was aware, with an odd cold clarity, that he might have stopped a great many things that afternoon with a single word, and that every hour of his design demanded he stand aside and let it run. He had summoned Corenza Sedley here to be looked at. He had wanted her small before the whole assembled county. He stood by the window and said nothing, and hated the taste of his own silence, and watched Adela, a thin, restless young woman with her mother's chin, cut through the throng and return herding Corenza before her into the cleared space at the heart of the room, the child still gripping her skirt. They made a study, the two women, and the room knew it and drew back to see. Lucasta stood in her wedding lace like something out of a bright hard dream, diamonds at her throat, and Corenza faced her in her plain dark travelling grey with the dust of the road still on the hem, without a jewel, without a flounce, her only ornament the straight set of her shoulders. Beside Lucasta she ought to have looked what they all named her, a nobody, a draggle-tail, a beggar off the highway. Fenwick waited for her to look it. She did not. She stood in the middle of that pitiless circle with her chin level and her hands quiet, one of them resting on the boy head, and she waited as a person waits who has weighed the worst that can be done to her and found she can bear it. So, said Lucasta, walking a slow half-circle about her, skirts hissing, here she is at last, the famous Miss Sedley. Or do you keep the courtesy of a name you were paid to give up? I confess I looked for something grander. His Grace spoke of you so very often. A ripple of low laughter. She had not, of course, and everyone understood the cut of it. But then 7 years upon a country pittance will wear the shine off anything. That gown, my dear, was it grey when you bought it, or only grey with age? One cannot tell. And to walk, they tell me, the last miles from the posting inn, because there was no carriage, on a wedding day, into a duke's chapel, with your— Lucasta's bright glance dropped to the child and lingered there, and her voice went silk-soft and dreadful. With your little companion. Whose is he, I wonder? For he is a well-grown boy for a woman who was sent away a maid and given nothing since but her keep. The road is long, they say, and lonely, and a pretty face pays for many a supper. Come, you are among friends. Tell the company whose he is. The room held its breath. Fenwick's hand had closed hard upon the cold stone of the window ledge without his bidding it, and he found he was leaning forward from the waist, every nerve strung tight, waiting for her answer as a man waits at a graveside, and still telling himself it was nothing to him, nothing, an old debt come to be collected, no more. Corenza did not flinch, and she did not weep, and she did not look at the boy, for to look at him would have been to feed them. She let the cruel question stand in the air until the very silence began to shame the woman who had asked it. Then she said, quite gently, in a low, clear voice that reached every corner of that great room, "He is his father's son, madam, in every particular, and one day, please God, the resemblance will be plain to everyone in this room. As for my gown, you have the right of it. It is old, and it is grey, and I have worn it a long while. I find that a thing may be worn a long while and still keep its use if it was honestly made." She paused, and for the first time her steady eyes moved not to the Duke, but to the diamonds at Lucasta's throat and back again. That is more than can be said of some newer things. It landed. He saw it land, saw the colour go up Lucasta's neck in an ugly mottled flush, saw the little wince run round the room as 300 people understood at the same instant that the draggle-tailed nobody had just, without raising her voice, drawn blood. Somebody near the door laughed and smothered it. Lucasta's mouth opened, and there was nothing polished in it now, nothing clever. There was only the plain fury of a woman who has swung her whole weight at a thing and found it did not move. "You insolent little, you dare," she got out. "You come here, into this house on my wedding day, dragging your bastard by the hand, and you dare stand upon your honesty. Fenwick," she wheeled toward the window, toward him, her voice climbing. "Fenwick, will you stand there? Will you let this creature affront me before the whole county in your own rooms? Send for the men. Have her put out into the yard where she belongs, and the brat with her, and let us have done and be married as we came to be." And that, he would think of it long afterward, in the grey hours, and never be able to give a clean account of it even to himself. That was the moment the design came apart in his hands. "No," said the Duke of Atherhall. The word fell into the room like a dropped stone. He had not planned it. He had planned nothing but silence and satisfaction, and instead he had crossed the floor without knowing he meant to move, and he stood now between the two women in the cleared space with the whole county staring, and the single flat word hung there. And he could not for his life have called it back. "No one will be put into the yard," he said, more quietly, and heard the iron come into it, the iron that had ended arguments in this house for 11 years. "She came at my summons." Whatever else she is here because I bade her come under my roof, and while she is under it she will be used as a guest is used, and not as a dog. That is an end of it." He did not look at Lucasta. He looked at the boy who had turned his grave dark face up to him, and was regarding him steadily without fear, with the very set of jaw and brow that Fenwick met every morning in his glass, and something turned over in him at the sight, slow and enormous, like a great ship coming round. "The company will forgive us," he said to the room at large, in the voice that was not asked to be obeyed, but simply was. The day has been disordered. Refresh yourselves. I will have a word apart with Miss Sedley, and matters will be settled." Lucasta made a sound low and incredulous. A word apart. With her. With her. He met his intended bride's eyes then for the first time, and what he saw in them, the affront, the calculation already stirring beneath it, the cold quick reckoning of how this might be turned to use, told him more in a heartbeat than 3 drawing-room courtships had told him in as many weeks, and he was aware of feeling nothing at all where a betrothed man ought to feel something, and of not, in that moment, greatly caring. "You will excuse me, madam." He did not offer Carenza his arm. That would have been a kindness, and he was not ready to have made her one. The thing had happened too fast, and half of him still stood by the window insisting it had not happened at all. But he inclined his head toward the door of the small library that opened off the far end of the drawing-room. And she understood, and she gathered the boy against her and came, and the crowd fell back before her passage now with a different quality in its silence than the one that had greeted her arrival. He shut the library door upon the whole staring county and the smell of lilies, and the sudden quiet was like cold water on a burn. For a moment neither of them spoke. He had imagined this too over 7 years, the moment he would at last have her before him with no one by, and all the things he would say, the accounting he would demand, the cold contempt he would pour out until it emptied him of the last of her. Now the moment was here and every word of it had gone. She stood by the shelves with the boy's shoulders under her 2 hands, and she waited, and it was he, the Duke of Atherhall, who could not find his tongue. "You should not have said that to her," he managed at last, and despised the smallness of it even as it left him. "About the resemblance being plain one day. It was rash. It will be repeated in every house in the county by morning. It is only the truth, your grace." She said it without heat. "You summoned me to be looked at. You did not, I think, summon me to lie. I am very tired of lies. I have lived inside one for 7 years, and I find I have no more use for them, whatever it costs me to say so. You are bold." "No." A faint, weary line touched the corner of her mouth, not a smile. "I was bold at 16. I have only since run out of things left to be afraid of. It is a different thing and a poorer one, and I would not recommend the road that brings a person to it." She looked down at the boy, and the whole of her face changed, softened, kindled, and then she looked up again and it was grave once more. "You wish to speak with me. Here I am. But I will ask one thing first, and it is not for myself. Let him be taken somewhere warm and given something to eat. He has come a very long way to stand and be stared at, and he has borne it better than the grown people in that room, and he is 6 years old. Whatever you mean to say to me, he need not hear it." It was not a plea. That was what undid him, that it was not a plea, that she asked it as one reasonable soul asks another, expecting to be met, offering him no flattery and no fear and no craven gratitude. Only the plain assumption that beneath the Duke there was a man who would not let a child go cold and hungry to spite its mother. No one had assumed such a thing of him in years. He was Atherhall. Men brought him their fear and their obedience and their careful, smooth deference, and laid it at his feet and went away. This slight grey woman, ruined by his own hand, standing in his library with nothing left in the world, but the boy under her hands, spoke to him as though she still believed there was something in him worth speaking to. And the terrible thing, the thing that made him turn abruptly to the bell rope so that she should not see his face, was how much of him rose up starving to be believed. He rang. He gave the order to the footman who came, quietly, that the boy be taken to the housekeeper's warm room and fed and let sit by the fire, and that no one trouble him, and he watched the child go, watched him look back once at his mother from the doorway and receive her small steadying nod, and then the door shut and they were alone. The Duke and the woman he had spent 7 years learning to hate, and the fire ticked in the grate. "Thank you," she said simply. "Do not." It came out rougher than he intended. He made himself face her. "Do not thank me. You do not know yet why I brought you here." "I think I do." She did not drop her eyes. "You brought me here to be broken, your grace, before as many people as your house would hold. You wrote me a letter to be sure I should read to the end and understand it." I understood it very well. She said it without reproach, which was worse than any reproach could have been. "I came notwithstanding. You may believe I came because I am a fool, or because I am poor and could not turn from the chance of your table. Believe what is easiest. But I did not come to be broken, and I find, standing here, that I cannot be, not any longer, not by you, not by that lady, not by all of them together. You broke everything of me that could be broken a long time ago. What is left is only the truth and the boy, and I will not give up to spare anyone's comfort, not even yours." He should have been angry. He had rehearsed the anger for 7 years. It was the warm coat he lived inside. He reached for it now, and it was not there. He stood in his own library in his wedding clothes, with the whole county waiting on the far side of the door to see him married, and he looked at Carenza Sedley's still grave face, and he was aware, with a kind of horror, with a helplessness he had not felt since he was 19 years old, that he did not want the exchange to end, that he wanted, of all the mad impossible things, to keep her here, to keep her talking, to hear that low, clear, honest voice go on saying true things to him in a room where no one else could hear, for as long as she would consent to stay. "There is more you are not telling me," he said low. "About the boy, about that summer, about the letters." He watched her go very still. "Is there not?" For the first time something crossed her face that might have been fear, not of him, he thought, but of the door she saw him standing at, the same door he had kept nailed shut for 7 years. "There is a great deal I am not telling you," she said quietly, "but not here. Not with 300 people at the keyhole and a bride waiting in her lace, and not because you commanded it in a letter meant to shame me. If ever you wish to hear it, your grace, you will have to ask me as one honest person asks another, not as a duke, and not as a man collecting a debt. I have paid you every debt I ever owed, and a good many I did not. I will not pay you the truth, that I will only give." And she inclined her head to him, grave and unhurried, and asked his leave to go to her son, and the Duke of Atherhall, who had never in 11 years wanted anything he could not command, stood mute in his own house and let her go, and knew, with the boarded planks coming off one by one in the wind, that he would move heaven and the whole staring county to hear the rest. The vestry door fell to behind them, and the great muffled sea sound of the chapel, the 400 voices risen, now past, all the bishops hushing into a single swelling murmur, closed away to a rumour beyond the oak, and Fenwick stood in the sudden narrowness of the little room, and did not know what to do with his hands. It was a poor plain chamber for so grand a house. A fire burned low in a small grate, a row of the bishop's vestments hung pale upon their pegs, a scoured table held the register and the ink, and a stub of candle guttering in a pewter dish. A high narrow window let in the grey of the failing afternoon. He had stood in this room an hour since while his man settled the last fold of his stock, and had been the antechamber of his triumph, and now it was some other place entirely, and he could not have named the country he had walked into. The boy went at once to the fire, as children do, and crouched before it with his small hands spread to the warmth, and after a moment tipped over sideways against the leg of the table with the boneless suddenness of a child who has travelled 2 days over bad roads, and is done at last with holding himself up. Fenwick watched him settle, watched the dark head droop, and could not look at him above a moment together for the thing it did to his chest. He turned instead to the woman, and found that she was watching the child too, with her whole face gone soft and unguarded in a way it had not been in all the long walk up the aisle, and that when she felt his eyes upon her she did not trouble to school it away. "He will sleep," she said quietly. "He has been very brave, and now he is done. Let him lie. He has heard enough grand people's business this day to last him." Carenza. Her name came out of him rough, unused, a thing he had not permitted his own mouth in 7 years, and the saying of it seemed to cost him some plank he had not known was still holding. The candle. What he said at the altar, the man his mother lights the candle for. He stopped. He had meant it for a demand, and it come out very nearly a plea. I would understand you. I have understood nothing since the organ faltered. Tell me what he meant. For a moment she said nothing. She crossed to the little grate and stood looking down into the low red of it, and her hands, he saw, were not quite steady where they clasped before her, and he understood that the composure she had carried up the idol before 400 staring eyes was costing her here, in the quiet, more than it had cost her there. Every night, she said at last, since he was old enough to fold his hands, I have lit a candle and set in the window and had him say a blessing before it. Not for me, for his father. She lifted her head, but she did not turn. I would not let him grow up hating a man he had never seen, Fenwick. It is an easy thing, hate, and it is a poison, and I had swallowed enough of it myself in the first year to know I would not have him weaned upon it. So I told him his father was a great man far away who had troubles too heavy for a small boy to carry, and that we would keep a light for him against the dark, and pray him safe, and ask no more than that. He does not know what you did. He does not know he was sent from this house before he drew his first breath. He knows only that somewhere there is a man his mother has never once let him curse, and that we keep a candle for him. That is all he meant. He is a child. He saw a great man at an altar and asked the only question in his heart. The fire ticked. Beyond the oak the murmur of the county rose and fell like surf on shingle. Fenwick found he had put his hand to the back of a chair and was holding it hard. You lit a candle, he said, for me. Every night. For 7 years. For 6, she said. I could not the first year. The first year I could scarcely light a fire to keep us from the cold. She turned then and faced him, and there was no reproach in it, only that grave steadiness that had unmade him at the altar. You wished to know what your purse bought me. I will tell you, since I am here, and since you summoned me to be told a truth, and it may as well be mine. It bought us passage to the far coast, where no one knew my name or yours, to a fishing town below the cliffs where the wind never stops and the whole place smells of salt and tar and the herring boats. It bought a widow's cottage of 2 rooms, damp in the walls with a good hearth. And it bought, when it was gone, for it was not so very great a sum as the county believed, and a woman alone with a coming child spends her store faster than she means to, it bought me the standing to hire out my needle without questions asked. And later to keep the letters and the sums for the fishing families who had none of them ever learned them, and later still to gather their children of a morning and teach them their alphabet from the one book I had carried out of this house in my box. I did not starve. I want you to know it plainly, so that you need pity me nothing. I worked, and I was poor, and I was not unhappy because I had him. She glanced to the sleeping child and back. I have been these 6 years a great deal happier than I was in this house at the end of it. I would not have you think otherwise out of any softness of the moment. It would not be true, and I have done with things that are not true. He heard the small edge that came into the last of it, the one hard corner in all her quiet, and he did not flinch from it, though it went into him. She had done with things that were not true. He was a man who had built a house of them and lived in it 7 years. And she had just told him so to his face without once raising her voice. And the terrible thing was that she was not wrong, and the more terrible thing was that he found he did not want her to soften it. He had softness enough from Lucasta, the warm flattering fiction that he was hard because he was strong, that his coldness was a kind of grandeur. This woman handed him the plain iron truth of himself as one hands a man his own coat at the door. And he stood there and took it and felt, absurdly, more seen than he had felt in the whole of his ordered life. The letters, he said. He had not meant to come to it so soon, or perhaps ever. He had lived 7 years by the discipline of never coming to it at all. But the door was down now, the whole boarded house of him was down, and a man standing in the ruin of his own defences finds he can say what he has never dared. There were letters, Carenza, in your hand. My father laid them before me. A flight arranged, a meeting, a sum of money, a man whose name I have never since been able to say. I did not. His voice failed, and he mastered it, and made himself go on, because she had given him her 7 years plainly, and he owed her at the least the naming of his own crime. I did not come to you. That is the thing I cannot hold in my mind even now. I did not put them in your hands and bid you answer them. I let my father sweep you out of this house in a week. and I signed what was set before me, and I never once asked you whether they were true. I have wondered. No, I have refused for 7 years to wonder. I refused it as a man refuses the drink that will finish him. Tell me now. I am asking you now. 7 years too late, in this poor room with the child asleep at your feet. Were they yours? Did you write them? The stillness that came over her then was of a different order than any she had shown him yet. She grew very white, and her hand rose of itself to the darn at the wrist of her grey glove and closed upon it. And for a long moment she looked at him across the small firelit room as though he had struck her, not with anger, but with the deep, helpless astonishment of one who has borne a wound so long she had ceased to expect it would ever be so much as looked at. No, she said, only that at first. And then, so low he leaned to hear it over the fire, I never wrote them. I did not know that man's name until I thrown at me across your father's table, with you standing behind him white as the wall and never once meeting my eyes. I begged you to look at me, Fenwick. Do you remember it? I do not think you do. You were 19 and drowning, and your father had you by the throat, and I was a steward's orphan with no name and no friend in the world and a hand that any clever person might learn to copy in an idle hour. I begged you to look at me and you would not, and by the week's end I was in a closed carriage on the coast road, and I understood that begging was a thing I must now put away, along with a great many other things, and I did. Her eyes were bright, but she did not let them fall. I did not write them. That is the whole of my defense, and I have no proof of it to give you, and I never had, and I am done at last with needing you to believe me. I lit the candle. I raised your son to think well of you against all reason. I did what love could still do from a great way off, because I found I could not stop, though God knows I tried. But I did not come here to plead my innocence, and I will not do it. Believe me or do not, I have lived either way. And Fenwick, who had commanded armies of servants and cowed magistrates and stared down the whole proud county from behind the mask he had spent his manhood casting, found that his eyes were wet, and that he did not care that they were, and that he believed her, not by any weighing of proofs. For she had offered him none, but by the plain unanswerable evidence of the woman herself, standing worn and poor and unbowed in the firelight with his sleeping son at her feet, and her innocence held out to him in 2 open, empty hands. He had known it, he understood now, from the moment the organ faltered. He had known it perhaps for 7 years, boarded up behind the plank he had never dared draw out, and had chosen the warm coat of hating her over the killing cold of the truth. Because the truth was that he had thrown away the one undefended thing his life had ever offered him on a lie at 19, and had let it lie thrown these 7 years while she lit a candle for him in a fisherman's window and taught his son his letters from her one book. I looked away, he said, and his voice was not steady, and he let it not be. You are right. I did not look at you then. I have not stopped looking at you since you came through that door, and I cannot make it undo the once I would not. He crossed the small room. He did not know he meant to until he had done it, and he stopped a pace from her, near enough now to see the grey daylight from the high window caught in the fine lines the years had drawn beside her eyes, near enough to see her breath come quick, and he lifted his hand. The hand that had signed the paper, the hand that had laid the letter of summons upon the salver as though it were something soiled, and he did not quite touch her face. It hovered, a breath from her cheek, trembling, and she did not draw back from it, and she did not lean into it. She only stood and looked up at him and let him choose, as she had let him choose everything all his life, and he found he could not bear the weight of the choosing and could not put his hand down either. Carenza, he said. It was scarcely a sound. Do not, she said, very gently, and it was not a refusal of him. It was a mercy, and he heard it so. Not here. Not with your bride and half the county the width of a door away, and nothing yet said out there that must be said, and everything still to lose. I am not 16, Fenwick, and you are not free, whatever this room has made you feel these 10 minutes. If you touch me now, it will be the wedding you are answering, and the guilt, and the boy, and I will not be had on the strength of a guilty afternoon. I have waited 7 years. I can wait until you know your own mind in the cold of tomorrow. A ghost of the old warmth crossed her face, the girl who had laughed at his gravity in the orchard surfacing for an instant through the grave woman she had become. You always did decide great things too fast and small things not at all. Put your hand down. There will be a time, if there is to be one, and it is not now, with him asleep and them waiting. He put his hand down. It was the hardest small thing he had done in 7 years, and he did it because she had asked it, and because she was right, and because he understood all at once that to be told the truth by her, and to heed it was the nearest thing to being made clean that his life was ever likely to offer him. He stepped back a pace, and even as he did, the murmur beyond the oak changed its note, sharpened, gathered, and there came the quick hard rap of knuckles upon the vestry door, and Lucasta's voice through it, no longer bright, stripped down to the cold bone of her fury. Fenwick, you have been the quarter of an hour, and a great deal more. My father is on his feet. My mother is asking, before the whole assembly, whether the Duke of Atherhall means to insult the house of Trevithick beneath his own roof for the sake of her, for the sake of that woman and her tale. A breath. When the voice came again it had recovered its glaze, and was the more dangerous for it. Come out, my dear, and let us mend this. There is nothing here that money and a firm hand will not put right by morning. Come out before it is past mending. You do not know, you do not begin to know, what my mother can do to a nameless woman who makes a spectacle of her daughter's wedding. Do not make me set her loose. Come out. Fenwick looked at the door, and at the sleeping child, and at the woman standing straight-backed between the two, and felt the whole waiting weight of the world he had built press in upon the little firelit room, the 400 watching faces, the Viscount on his feet, the Viscountess whose power along the eastern boundary was real and long and unforgiving, the settlement papers, the questions of name and right and legitimacy that would fall upon a fatherless boy like wolves the moment this door opened, the plain brutal truth that he had summoned this woman here to break her, and had instead, in the space of a quarter of an hour, come to understand that she was the one true thing in his life, and that in coming to understand it he had set her squarely in the path of everything that great houses do to protect themselves. He had believed an hour ago that he held all the power in this chapel. He saw now that he had only pointed it, like a loaded gun, at the two people in the world he could least afford to lose. I am coming, he called, and did not know his own voice, so quiet had it gone, so certain. He turned to Corenza. Stay here. Bolt the door behind me, and let no one in until I come for you myself. No one, Corenza, not the bishop, not a servant, not a card sent in a fine hand, no one but me. Whatever you hear said out there, hold to that. He looked at her a moment longer, taking in the whole of her, the darn at the glove and the grey worn gown and the still grave lovely face he had thrown away at 19 and found again at 36 at the ruin of his own wedding. I do not yet know how I am to mend this, he said. I know only that I will not do again the thing I did at 19. I will not look away, whatever it costs me out there, and it will cost me everything the county reckons worth having. I will not look away from you again. She said nothing. But as he turned to the door her hand came out at last and caught his sleeve, the one touch he had denied them both, given now not in pleading, but in a fierce brief pressure, there and gone, that said more than any speech she might have made, and then she let him go, and drew the child gently against her skirts, and stood ready to bolt the door as he had bidden. Fenwick set his hand to the latch, and drew one long breath of the salt and tallow air of that poor room as though it were the last clean air he should breathe for some while, and went out to face the 400, and the Viscountess and the cold bright fury of the woman he was no longer, by any oath he meant to keep, going to marry. The dusk let him go with reluctance. He came in from the terrace with the cold garden air still clinging to his coat, and something warmer than that clinging under it, in the place where for 7 years he had let nothing warm survive, the memory of a hand a hair's breadth from his own upon the balustrade, of a gaze held past the moment when either of them ought decently to have let it fall, of a thing said and half said and left, tremulous and unfinished, in the blue failing light among the bare limes. He was 36 years old, and he walked back into his own blazing house like a boy coming from a first tryst, unsteady, undefended, but the world should look so altered for a quarter of an hour spent beside a plain grey woman on a cold stone step. He had gone out to that terrace meaning, he had told himself, to be rid at last of the disorder of the day. He came back from it knowing that he had instead walked further into it than any letter or summons had ever carried him, and that he did not, God help him, wish to walk back. He knew within 3 steps of the hall that something was wrong, It was not the noise, though the house was loud still with the 400 guests he had failed to marry before. It was the quality of the quiet under the noise. The way 2 footmen by the stair looked at him, and then very carefully did not. The way old Bramwell came toward him across the marble with a candle in his hand that he did not need, for the sconces were all ablaze, and with his careful old face gone grave past its usual gravity. The steward had served the house through 2 dukes and had learned in that service precisely when to hold his tongue. That he did not hold it now, that he came forward at all uninvited, told Fenwick more than the words that followed. "Your Grace." Bramwell's voice was pitched low for him alone. "I would not have you go into the long gallery unwarned. Miss Lucasta has gathered the company there, a great many of them, and her mother the Viscountess with her. They have had the strong room opened. I could not in conscience refuse the key, the settlement being Miss Lucasta's affair to see to as things stand, or so my lord her father would have it. But it was not only the settlement they wanted from it." The old man's throat worked. "They have brought out the other papers, your Grace. The papers late father laid before you, 7 years since." Fenwick stood very still in the middle of his own hall. He had a sensation, familiar and long dreaded, of the floor going soft beneath his polished shoes, of a cold coming up out of some deep place he had spent the better part of a decade nailing shoot. The letters. He had not looked at them since the night his father set them on the library table and said, "This is what they are, boy." He had thought them locked away with the deed of her removal, and the receipts of the purse he had bought her silence with, dead paper in a dead cause. And he had been glad past speaking never to see that neat slanting hand again. That Lucasta had them now, that she had gone into the dark of the muniment room and drawn them up like a body out of a well, and carried them into the light of 400 candles. Struck him with a dread out of all proportion to a bundle of old correspondence, and he understood the dread even as he felt it, that the letters were the last standing wall of the boarded house, and that some part of him had come running back from the terrace precisely because it feared what would happen to that wall if he let it stand another hour. "Thank you, Bramwell," he said, and heard his own voice come out level and cold and reasonable, and hated it. He went in. The long gallery blazed from end to end, the painted other halls looking down out of their dark frames upon a scene got up expressly for their pleasure. Lucasta had chosen her stage with her old sure instinct. She stood at the centre of it in her wedding lace with the diamonds still at her throat, and she had gathered the flower of the county about her in a wide, bright half-circle, and upon a small gilt table at her side, spread out fanwise beneath a branch of candles so that every soul who cared to lean might read them, lay the letters. Corenza had been brought. He saw it in a glance, saw that this had been arranged, the woman fetched down and set at the focus of the ring as she had been set at the heart of the drawing-room that afternoon, with Jory once more at her skirts and once more too small and too grave for the pit that had been dug about him. She was not looking at the letters. She was looking, when Fenwick came through the door, straight at him, and something crossed her face at the sight of him that he would carry to his grave. A flare of pure gladness quickly mastered, as though for one unguarded instant she had believed his coming meant her rescue. "Ah," said Lucasta, turning, and her voice was silk laid over steel, warm with a pleasure she took no pains to hide. "Here is his Grace at last come in from the cold. How well you look, Fenwick, quite renewed. We were speaking of you, or rather of the lady's long devotion to you, of which she has told us all so touchingly this last hour, and of which you will hardly credit it, my dear. The proofs have been in your own strong room the whole while. Cousin Adela, the candle nearer. His Grace will wish to see." She lifted the topmost sheet between 2 gloved fingers, delicately, as a woman lifts a thing she does not care to soil her glove upon, and held it toward him. "Do you know the hand, Fenwick? I think you must. She writes a very pretty hand, your Miss Sedley." She wrote a very pretty hand at 17 when she wrote these. He did not take it. He did not need to take it. He knew the hand across the width of the gallery, knew it the way a man knows a face he has tried for years to forget and cannot, the neat forward slant of it, the particular open loop of the letter she made her name with, the hand that had copied out verses for him in the orchard and laughed at his gravity and become, in the black week after, the hand that had betrayed him. And with the knowing of it the cold came up complete, and the boarded house began, plank by plank, out of some dreadful long habit of the blood, to reassemble itself around him. His father's grey, terrible face, the packet on the table. This is what they are, boy. They take your name and your bed, and they sell you the moment a better offer comes. He had lived 11 years and more inside that sentence. He had made a fortress of it and a coat of it and a whole hard serviceable self of it. And he stood now in the blaze of his own gallery and felt the old walls rise, and felt, he could not afterward deny that he had felt it, a species of relief. The relief of the condemned man who is told the reprieve was a clerk's error and the rope is real after all. It was terrible, and it was easier than the terrace had been, and for the space of a dozen heartbeats the Duke of Atherhall let it hold him. Read it aloud, Adela, Lucasta was saying. And the thin, restless girl took up a sheet in an eager voice and read a line arranging meeting at a certain milestone after dark, a line naming a sum, a line begging haste and secrecy, and a name at the foot of it, a man's name that Fenwick had never in 7 years been able to say and did not say now, though it went through him like the old needle sliding clean between the ribs. A murmur ran round the bright half-circle, low and avid. The Viscountess, planted by the cold hearth, said to the room in her carrying voice that she had always known it, that she had said as much to her poor dear husband at the time, that the creature had been bought off far too gently, and had now come crawling back to practise the very same arts, and that this, she flung out her fan toward Jory, toward the small, grave, dark-headed boy. This was the pretty fraud she meant to pass upon a duke for money, a base-born child of that same low man, and carried here, to be sworn an Atherhall and set above them all. It is imposture, the Viscountess declared, ringing. It is a felony and no less, and there is a magistrate in this very room. My Lord Pengarrow, you have heard her own hand read out. I say she should be given to the law before she is suffered to sleep another night beneath this roof, and the brat with her, and let the assizes sort the truth of it. And still Fenwick did not speak. That was the thing. He would go over it after, in the grey hours, again and again, and never make it come right, that at the one moment when a single word from him would have turned it all. He stood at the door of his own gallery with the letters spread and the ring of avid faces waiting and his father's voice loud in his blood, and he wavered. He looked at the neat slanting hand and he did not see the woman on the terrace. He saw the boy of 19 drowning, and the coat that had kept him warm ever since, and it seemed to him for one hideous swimming moment that all of this, the summons, the interrupted vows, the candle-lit hour in the garden that had nearly unmade him, had been the trap, and this the deliverance, and that a wiser and a harder man would say the word the Viscountess wanted and be free. He felt the word rise in him. He looked at Carenza Sedley to find the strength to say it. And it was her face that stopped his tongue, not by pleading, for she did not plead, but by the absence of every craven thing he had steeled himself to meet. She had listened to the whole of it without a movement, without a flinch, standing with one hand quiet upon her son's shoulder and her eyes going from the letters to the Viscountess to Lucasta, and at the last to him. And there was no fear in her that he could find, and no scramble to defend, and no snatching after the papers to tear them or cry them false. She only looked at him, gravely, out of that still lovely older-than-its-years face, and when the Viscountess's ringing charge had died away into the eager hush she spoke, and her low clear voice went into every corner of the gallery as it had gone that afternoon into every corner of the drawing-room. They are a fair copy of a wicked thing, she said, and I will not stand here and pull them apart line by line for your entertainment. I could. There is not one sheet upon that table that would keep its shape if I set my hand against it, and there are those living yet who could say why. Her eyes moved once, and Fenwick saw them touch old Bramwell, where he stood grey and stricken by the door, and move on. But I told your Grace this afternoon in your library that I would not pay you the truth as a debt, that I would only give it, and freely, and to the man and not the Duke. I meant it then. I mean it now, when it will cost me more to hold to it than you can well imagine. You have been shown a paper in my hand, Fenwick, and beside you stands a living child with your own face. If you will believe the paper over the boy, if that is still the easier thing, after everything, then there is nothing I can say tonight that you would credit, and I will spend no more of what is left me trying. She drew Jory a little closer against her skirts. Do as you must. You always have. I have never yet known you to do otherwise. It was not a plea, and it was not a reproach, and it undid him more than any weeping could have done, but it undid him too late, or so it seemed, for even as the walls of the boarded house shuddered again at the sound of her, the machinery she disdained to fight went grinding on without her. Lucasta had seen the wavering in him. Quick as she saw everything, she moved to close it. "You hear her, Fenwick," she said softly, coming to his side, laying her gloved hand upon his sleeve as she had laid it in the chapel and the gallery before. "There are those who could say why, she tells us, and yet she will name none of them and swear to nothing and prove nothing, only stand and be tragic and trust to your soft heart to do the rest. It is the oldest art there is. My mother is right. Let the law have the sifting of it. If she is honest, she has nothing to dread from a magistrate, and if she is not, you are well quit of her and of the whole 7 years' shame at last." Her fingers tightened. "Say the word, my dear, and be free of it. You need only not stop us. That is the whole of what is asked of you. Only stand still." And there, he could give no clean account of it ever after. There the Duke of Atherhall, who had ended arguments in that house for 11 years with a single flat syllable, stood still. He did not say the word the Viscountess wanted. He could not, with Corenza's grey eyes on him, bring the felon's word up past his teeth. But neither did he say the other, the word that would have swept the letters from the table, and the county from the gallery, and set the woman and the boy behind the shield of his name, and his silence in that ring of leaning faces was answer enough, and worse than answer. Lord Pengarrow the magistrate cleared his throat and rose, unwirous, murmuring that if there were indeed a charge laid and a felony sworn, he supposed the forms must be observed, the lady detained, the child kept, the matter carried before the bench in the morning. The Viscountess said, "That is very proper." Adela began to gather the letters into their bundle with careful, triumphant fingers. And Fenwick stood mute in the door of his gallery beneath the eyes of 3 centuries of his blood, and let it happen, because for one long, unforgivable moment the coat was warm and the truth was cold, and he was too great a coward to choose the cold. He saw the change come into Corenza's face then, and it was the worst thing he had seen that day, worse than her arrival at the west door, worse than the child's clear voice in the chapel. It was not despair, it was recognition. She looked at him standing silent while they gathered the papers to ruin her, and he watched her read in his stillness the shutting of the very door she had told him that afternoon he would have to ask her, as one honest soul asks another to see opened. He watched her understand that he had shut it, that after the terrace and the held gaze and the hour in the blue dark he had, when it came to the point, believed his father's paper over his own son's face. And he watched the lost small living hope of him go out of her eyes like a candle pinched between 2 fingers. She did not cry out. She did not appeal to him again. She gathered her son up against her, and she bent and said something low into his dark hair that made the boy stand straighter. And then she lifted her head and looked once round the bright, triumphant gallery with a dignity that made every jewelled woman in it seem, for that instant, the smaller creature. "Then I will not wait to be taken," she said quietly. "I will go with the gentleman where he pleases, and answer his bench in the morning as honestly as I have answered you tonight, and God dispose of the rest, for I am done disposing of it myself." She turned Jory gently toward the door. "Only I will ask that the boy be let stay in the warm till morning, and not lie in any cold place on my account. He has done nothing. Whatever I am, he is his father's son. I have said it once in this house today, and I will say it going out of it. And one day that will be plain to every soul now standing so glad to see me gone." She inclined her head to the room, grave and unhurried, as a queen might to a court that had condemned her. "I wish you joy of your wedding, madam. I hope it keeps its shine longer than my gown has kept mine." And she walked from the gallery with her hand upon her son's shoulder and her back straight as a young birch, past the leaning faces and the smothered whispers, past old Bramwell, who had gone the colour of ash and taken a half-step from the wall with his mouth working as though so long held down were fighting its way at last to the surface, and then thought better of it, or was frightened out of it, and sank back. Past the very door where the Duke of Atherhall stood rooted, so near to her that her grey skirt brushed his shoe as she went by, and she did not look at him, and he did not put out his hand. Lucasta's fingers were warm and triumphant on his sleeve. The candles burned. The painted Atherhalls looked down, and Fenwick stood where the terrace and the 7 years had left him, in the wreck of his own silence, and watched the one true heart he had ever been given walk out of his house toward a magistrate's cell with his son's hand fast in hers, and knew. As the door closed upon her grey figure and a low, pleased murmur of victory ran round the gallery, that the cruel had won, and that he had helped them do it, they had brought her out into the light after all, whatever oath he had sworn at the vestry door, whatever bolt she had drawn behind him. It had not held against the thing the Viscountess Trevithick had set loose in the great chapel, while he stood a foolish quarter of an hour among the pews and let her do it. For when Fenwick turned from the altar rail at the sound of the small proud voice, he knew. There was Corenza upon the chancel steps in her grey worn gown with the boy's hand fast in hers, brought down the long aisle under 400 pairs of eyes by 2 of the Viscountess's own people, and made to stand where all the county might look their fill. And the county looked. He saw the fans go up and the heads incline together, saw the slow cruel pleasure move along the rows like wind across a wheat field, and he understood, with the sick lurch of a man who has watched a thing done in his name and by his own earlier consent, that they had already, in the 10 minutes of his absence, decided what she was. For the Viscountess had not been idle. Upon the credence table beside the altar, where the register and the bishop's book had lain, there was spread now a little sheaf of yellowed papers. And Fenwick knew them, though he had not seen them in 7 years and had prayed never to see them again. The letters, his father's letters, the flight arranged, and the meeting, and the man's name, sent for from the muniment room of his own house by a servant who knew better than to refuse the mother of the bride. She had read them out. He gathered it from the faces before he gathered it from anything else. She had stood in the chancel of his wedding and read out in her carrying drawing-room voice the whole 7-year-old libel, and dressed it new as proof that the woman on the steps was no wronged first wife come for justice, but a proven adventuress returned with a base-born child to extort a duke at the very foot of his second altar. And he, God forgive him, he had stood and let the old sickness rise in him at the sight of that hand. He had once been taught to call her hand, and for one black moment, with the letters spread and the county watching and his father's voice 7 years dead speaking again out of the yellow paper, the boarded man he had been had risen in him whole, and he had not spoken, and his silence had been answer enough. The Viscountess had read his face as easily as she read the room. She had won. She stood now with her chin high and her daughter white and rigid at her side, and she was waiting, with the patience of long power, for the Duke of Atherhall to come to heel and cast the beggar woman out of his house a second time. "You see, your grace," the Viscountess said, and her voice went out over the assembly smooth as poured cream, "how these creatures are made. A little cleverness, a borrowed grief, a child got who knows where and taught to say his piece at an altar, and they will unmake a great house for sport if a firm hand does not check them. There is no call for unkindness. She shall be seen off the land and given her fare, and by Michaelmas none shall remember she was here. Only speak the word, my dear Duke. Own before your friends what you have always known her to be, and let us go on with the day that a wicked hour has spoiled." Fenwick looked at Corenza. She had not wept, and she did not plead. She stood with the boy drawn against her skirts and her free hand closed. He saw even at that distance, upon the darn at the wrist of her grey glove, as it had closed in the vestry when he asked her the cruel question, and she had answered it with 2 empty open hands. She was looking at him, not in appeal. She had told him plainly she was done with appeal, and she meant it, but with the same grave steadiness she had carried up the aisle. The look of a woman who has already counted the cost and found she can pay it and keep herself whole, and who asks of him now only the small mercy that he not pretend at the end to be surprised by what he does. She expected him to fail her. That was the thing that went into him like a blade. She had lit a candle for him 6 years in a fisherman's window and raised his son to bless his name, and she stood there expecting, with a calm that was worse than any accusation, to be cast out again by the man she had loved undefended, and to bear it, and to go back to the salt coast and light the candle still. He opened his mouth and did not yet know what he would say, only that it would not be the Viscountess's word, and it was in that suspended instant, before any word at all, that the thing happened which no one in the chapel had reckoned upon. An old man was rising slowly from the third pew on the family's side. Fenwick knew him before he knew what his rising meant, knew the stooped narrow shoulders and the rusty black and the long grey face he had seen bent over deeds and settlements at his father's elbow the whole of his boyhood. Mr. Treffry, who had been man of law, man of business to the Dukes of Atherhall these 40 years, who had drawn the very marriage settlement that was to have been signed within the hour, and who had sat all this while so still in his corner that not one of the bright company had marked him. He came out into the aisle with the careful deliberation of the very old, and he did not look at the Viscountess, and he did not look at the 400. He looked at Fenwick, and there was upon his dry face a thing Fenwick had never seen there in 35 years. The innate working of a man who has carried a stone too long and has just now, past all prudence, set it down. "Your Grace will forgive an old servant," said Mr. Treffry, and though his voice was thin it went into the vault of the chapel and the whispering died before it, for a company that will not hush for a bishop will always hush for the promise of a scandal. "I am too old to be turned off, and I have no wife nor child to be beggared for my speaking, and I find that I cannot sit in this pew and hear those papers read for proof, and see that lady stand where she stands, and hold my tongue as I have held it 7 years. I held it once, and it has been the ruin of my sleep ever since. I will not carry it to my grave. This is no place," the Viscountess began, but Mr. Treffry turned upon her a look of such mild and terrible age that even she left the sentence in the air. "Madam, it is precisely the place. You have had those letters read for truth before 400 witnesses. I will have the truth of them told before the same." He drew from within his rusty coat a packet Fenwick had never seen, tied in black tape gone grey with keeping, and he held it up, and his old hand did not shake. "I know the hand that wrote the letters upon that table, your Grace, for I stood by while it was hired to write them. They are not the lady's hand. They were never the lady's hand. They were made, copied from 3 true notes of her housekeeping, an afternoon's work, by a clerk out of Bristow named Jeffcott, whom your late father the Duke paid 40 guineas and a passage to the Indies to write them and be gone, and the gentleman whose name they carry, that has been thrown at this lady across 2 tables now, was paid the like never to deny a story he was too great a coward to refute. Your father did it, Fenwick. I will say it now, he is past my loyalty and past his own harm. He would not have the heir of Atherhall wived to a steward's orphan, and when persuasion failed of you he bought a lie instead, and I drew the papers of the nullity upon that lie with my own pen, knowing it false, 'cause I was his creature and afraid. This packet is his own hand. He turned it that the seal might be seen. A confession he set down in his last sickness, when the fear of God came on him at the end as it comes on such men, and gave into my keeping under his seal to be used. These are his words within, if ever the wrong should rise again to be righted, or to stay my hand from a worse. There is no worse than what was toward this day. He has bound me from beyond the grave to speak, and I thank God for it, for I had not the courage else." The silence in the chapel was of a kind Fenwick had never heard in that or any room, the silence of 400 people who came for a spectacle, and have been given instead a judgment. He was aware of the Viscountess's face going from white to a mottled grey, of the Viscount half risen and sunk again, of the bishop's hands opening helplessly upon his book, but he was aware of these things only at the edge of himself, as a man drowning is aware of the shore. The whole centre of him had gone to the yellow letters on the table, and the grey packet in the old man's hand, and the plain unbearable meaning that ran between them like a struck spark. His father had done it, not a rival, not a cruel chance, not the world's hard machinery, his own father, whom he had obeyed at 19 because obedience was the only shape of love that house had taught him, had bought a clerk to forge a girl's ruin and had let his son believe it, and had watched him board up his heart upon the lie, and had carried the truth to his deathbed and set it down and sealed it and died, and Fenwick had helped him. That was the part that would not be got round. He had been handed the lie and he had chosen it every day for 7 years, chosen the warm coat of hating her over the cold of asking one honest question, and had come within a hair, within a single spoken word before all these people, of choosing it again this very hour and casting her out a second time upon the strength of his father's 40 guinea sin, "Let me see it," Fenwick said. His voice did not sound to him like his own. Mr. Treffry crossed and put the packet into his hands, and he broke the grey seal, and he read not the whole of it there in the chancel, for the letters swam, and he could not have read the whole. But he read enough. He read his father's hand, that he would have known among 10,000. Setting down the clerk's name and the 40 guineas and the passage to the Indies, setting down that the woman was innocent and had never known nor written nor plotted anything, setting down at the last, in the wavering script of a dying and frightened man, "I did it that the name might not be lowered, and I have lowered it past all my fearing, and God forgive me. And if my son has any better heart than I bred into him, let him mend what I have broke." Fenwick stood in the chancel of his own wedding with his father's confession in his 2 hands, and found that his father had known him better dead than living, had gambled, at the last, on a better heart than he had troubled to look for while he lived. And the gamble had very nearly failed for the want of a single hour. He looked up. He looked first, past everyone, at Corenza, and she was not steady now. The composure that 400 cruelties had not broken had broken at last upon a single mercy. The one thing she had ceased 7 years ago to hope for, which was not his love but merely the truth spoken aloud where others could hear it. And she stood with the boy's face turned up, wondering to hers, and her own face wet and open, undone at last as he was undone. The 2 of them made naked before the whole staring county by the same old dying hand. Then Fenwick turned, with the packet still open in his grip, and he looked at the Viscountess Trevithick. "You read those letters out," he said, and the quiet of his voice carried further than any shout could have done. "You sent to my father's muniment room, and you had my servants fetch you a dead man's forgery, and you stood in my chapel and read a lie to 400 people to break a woman who has more honour in the darn of her glove than there is in the whole of your house. You did not know it was a lie. I will grant you that much and no more, but you did not care whether it was a lie. You cared only that it would do its work, as your daughter has cared these 2 months only that the thing be got, and the woman crushed who stood between. He heard the small choke sound Lucasta made, and he did not spare it. There is the whole difference between the 2 women you have made to stand before this company today, madam, and it is written for anyone to read. One of them lit a candle 7 years for a man who had thrown her out, and taught his son to bless him, and asked for nothing, and told me to my face she would not be had on the strength of a guilty afternoon. The other read a forgery aloud at a wedding for sport. I know at last which of them I am not fit to marry, and it is not the one upon the steps. He should have felt triumphs. He felt none. He felt only the cold clean sweep of a house being emptied of a lie it had held so long the walls had taken the shape of it. He saw the Viscountess reach for speech and find none, saw the smooth machinery of her power seize and stop before the very people whose deference had been its whole engine, so that in the space of a minute she was only an elderly woman in too many jewels standing in another family's chapel with a wicked act exposed upon her, and the county that had bent to her all its life beginning, in the rustle on the turned shoulder, to unbend. He saw Lucasta's beautiful ruined face turn from her mother to him and back, hunting an ally in a room that had none left for her. He would deal with them justly, and later, the settlement would not be signed, and every soul present knew it now. He set the packet down upon the letters, the true hand upon the false, and turned his back upon the house of Trevithick as a man turns from a fire that has gone out, and went toward the steps to claim, before them all, the wife his father had stolen from him and given back only in the grave. But Corenza was no longer on the steps. While he had been speaking his justice to the Viscountess, the whole hall's eyes upon him and the drama of it, she had done the thing she had told him in the vestry she would do. The thing he might have known she would do if he had thought a moment past his own vindication. She had stooped and gathered the boy, who was frightened now by the great strange silence and the wet on his mother's face, and she had turned, quietly, away from the 400, and gone. He caught the last of it, the grey gown and the dark head against her shoulder passing out through the small north door by the vestry, the door that gave on to the cloister and the gardens and the long avenue, and, beyond it, the road that led north and west and back at the end of all things to the salt coast and the widow's cottage and the candle in the window, and he understood in one stroke why she went. And it was the truest measure yet of the woman and the sharpest spur, that had ever been set to him. She would not be installed as Duchess of Atherhall by an old man's confession and a legal nullity before a gaping county. She had told him she wanted the man and not the rescue, and she had meant it, and a vindication read out before 400 was still only a rescue. And rather than stand and be given back to him by circumstance, she had chosen, even now, even proven and cleared and lifted above every soul who had scorned her, to walk out of his grand house on her own 2 feet with her son in her arms and let him come after her if he wanted her, come as a man, and not as a duke mending his estate, and not as a penitent and not before an audience, but truly of his own free choosing, into the cold of tomorrow she had named, and Fenwick, who had let her be carried down an aisle to be shamed, who had stood silent while a lie was read, who had come within 1 word of failing her a second time and failed her a first, for the want of ever once running toward her instead of away. Fenwick did not weigh it, or wait, or think of the 400 faces, or a single thing the county reckoned worth the having. He put his father's confession into old Treffry's hands and came down off the chancel steps at a stride that was very nearly a run, and the bright astonished company parted before the Duke of Atherhall as it had parted before him all his life, though never once for this. Never because he was chasing through his own scandalized, wedding the one undefended thing his life had ever offered him and thrown away. He went out through the small north door into the grey garden air after the grey gown and the dark head, calling her name aloud where anyone might hear it. The name he had not let his mouth say in 7 years and now could not stop saying, running down the cloister and out under the failing sky toward the woman who did not turn, not yet, did not quicken her step either, who walked and let him come. He did not remember crossing the gallery. 1 moment he had stood rooted in the wreck of his own silence with 3 centuries of painted blood looking down at him. The next he was through the great doors and running, a thing no man living had seen the Duke of Atherhall do. Down the cold length of the corridor with the sconce flames wheeling past, and the altered roar of the company falling away behind him like water closing over a dropped stone. For the roar had changed. It had changed the instant old Bramwell found the tongue he had swallowed for 7 years and laid his shaking hand upon the topmost sheet, and said, before the county and the candles and the God of the little chapel, that he had carried those letters to the milestone himself at another's bidding, and that the hand upon them was no more Corensa Sedley's than his own, and had changed again past mending, when the man who had been paid to slant that pretty forgery was named, and the purse traced, and the whole rotten 7-year engine dragged up into the light with Lucasta Trevithick's white face at the heart of it. Fenwick did not stay to watch her unmasked. He had seen enough of her face in that one instant to last him his life. He wanted only one face now, and it was going out of his house into the dark, and he ran to reach it before the dark should have it for good. The west door stood open upon the cold. She was there, not yet gone, a grey figure at the foot of the steps in the blue flare of the flambucks, with the boy's hand in hers and the Viscountess's own travelling chaise brought round in cruel readiness to bear her off to Lord Pengaro's bench. The magistrate stood by it, but he had let his hand fall from the door. Word had come out ahead of Fenwick, the way word will, and Pengaro was staring back up at the blazing house with his heavy face gone slack and uncertain. A man who has sworn a warrant upon a lie and feels it turning to ash in his glove. Corensa was not looking at the magistrate. She had halted upon the last step with her back to the chaise as though she would not be handed into it, and she had turned at the sound of the door flung wide. And she was looking up at Fenwick where he stood bareheaded and breathing hard at the top of his own stairs, and there was no gladness in her face now. There was only a great and terrible stillness, the stillness of one who has already emptied her hands of hope and does not mean to be made to pick it up again. He came down the steps slowly. He had run the length of the house, and now, before her, he could not go fast. Each stair cost him, for he knew what he had done and knew that no swiftness of feet could carry him across the thing he had let happen in that gallery. He stopped 1 step above her, and then, because 1 step above was still the posture of a duke, he came down the last and stood level, on the cold flags in the wind, with the boy between them looking gravely up. Bramwell has spoken, he said. His voice would not come as he wished it. The letters are shown for what they are. You are charged with nothing. You will go nowhere tonight but where you please to go. He drew a breath that hurt him. That is the small thing, and I say it first so that it is said, and so that you know you are free of them whatever else befalls between you and me. But it is not what I came to say. No, she said. I did not think it was. She was very quiet. Say the rest then, your grace, and let me go in out of the cold, for the boy is tired. The old title, given back to him so evenly, was the cruelest thing she could have done, and she had not meant it cruelly, and that was crueler still. He looked at her plain grey gown and her plain grey shawl and the 7 years written fine about her eyes, and he understood, standing there, that he had spent the whole of those years inside a father had cut for him out of a lie, and that she had spent them outside it, in the weather, keeping faith with a man who had cast her off. And the last plank of the boarded house came away in his hands, and he let it fall. I stood in that gallery, he said, and I let them gather the papers to ruin you, and I did not speak. You saw me not speak. You will not have imagined that I could unsay it, and I cannot. It is done and I did it, and there is no hour of my life I would sooner give my name and my lands to have back. I want you to hear me name it, before I ask you anything, so that you never suppose I have made it small. I was a coward. My father put a poison in me at 19, and I drank it every day for 11 years because it was easier to be hard than to be broken again, and tonight, when it came to the point, I would rather have believed a dead man's forgery than my own living son's face. Because the forgery asked nothing of me and the boy asked everything. That is the whole ugly truth of it. I am not come down these steps to tell you I never faltered. I am come to tell you I faltered and saw you read it, and would sooner die than ever be that man again. She said nothing. But her hand, he saw, had tightened upon the boy's. I do not offer you my name to save you, he went on, and now the words came. Now they came out of him in a flood he could not have dammed, for you are already saved, and you never wanted saving. You told me in the library that you would not take the truth as a debt, and I will not insult you now by holding out my rank like a purse to a beggar at the door. You have been offered my purse before, and would not spend a farthing of it in 7 years of want. Bramwell has told me that too. This last quarter hour, that you sent 3/4 money back unbroken, that you sewed for your bread and let the boy go in mended coats sooner than touch a shilling of Atherhall gold. A woman who would not take my money to live will not want my coronet to be comfortable. I know that. I offer you nothing to save you. He stopped, his hands were shaking and he let them shake. I ask you because I love you. Because you walked into my chapel to be shamed, and instead you undid me. You, in your grey gown, with your quiet voice, undid in one afternoon what I had spent 11 years making proof against every soul alive. Because there is a terrace in this house where I stood an hour ago with your hand a breadth from mine, and knew that I had never in my life been warm until that minute. I am asking Corenza Sedley, who owes me nothing, whether she can find it in her to be asked at all by the fool who let her walk toward a gale, not the Duke. Man, only ever the man. You said you would give the truth to none other. I have come to give you mine on the same terms, and to stand here in the cold until you answer, or send me away. For a long moment the only sound was the wind in the flambeaux and, from up in the house, the low broken murmur of a wedding that had come apart in the hand. Corenza looked at him. The stillness in her face did not break all at once. It went, rather, the way ice goes on a pond in a thaw, from the edges inward, until at the last her eyes filled and she let them, and did not turn away to hide it as a proud woman might, but stood and let him see the whole cost of what he asked and what she had carried. You want to know what I can find in me? She said low. I will tell you, since you have been so honest, and shame us both no further with pretending. I never stopped. Her voice did not break, but it came near. 7 years, Fenwick. I loved you the day your father's men put me out of the gate, and I loved you through the confinement that came after, when I had no name to give the child, but the one you had taken from me, and I loved you when I heard you were to marry. And I put on this gown and answered your summons and came here to be laughed at because a part of me could not stay away from the one place on earth that had you in it, even to be laughed at in it. That is my folly, and I have never been able to cure it. I did not keep the money because I wanted you to owe me nothing. I did not tell the world of the boy because I wanted you to come to him, to us of your own heart, not at all. I would not buy a duke with his own son. I wanted the man. I have only ever, God help me, wanted the man. A tear went down and she let it. And when you stood silent in that gallery, I thought the man was dead, and that I had spent my one life loving a coat. Do not, her breath caught. Do not tell me now that he is not dead, Fenwick, unless it is true, for I cannot bury him twice. It is true, he said. Feel. And he did then the thing he had wanted to do upon the terrace and had not dared. He took her hand, not the ghost of it. Not the breath of cold air between, but her hand, small and roughened with 7 years of the needle, into both of his, and held it against the front of his coat where the heart was, so that she should feel for herself that it beat and beat for her. He is not dead, you would not let him die. You put out a candle in that gallery, you thought, and it was the only light I had, and I have run the length of my own house on the strength of the memory of it. Marry me again on the true terms, before all of them or before none of them, as you choose. Not to be a duchess. To let me spend what is left me being the man you would not stop loving even when he did not deserve 1 hour of it. She looked down at her hand held to his heart, and then up, and the last of the ice was gone. Yes, she said, so simply that it went through him deeper than any vow beneath the chapel roof had ever gone. Yes, you great fool, I will. Between them, small and grave and cold, Jory tugged once at his mother's shawl. Mama, he said, in the clear carrying voice that had rung out in the chapel that afternoon and stopped 400 hearts, is the tall man crying? Fenwick went down. He did not decide to. He found himself on one knee upon the freezing flags of his own courtyard, level at last with the small dark-headed boy who had his own brow and his own straight look and his mother's mouth, and for a moment he could not speak at all. He managed, a little. It is allowed, once or twice in a life. He put out his hand and stopped it short of the boy and looked up at Corenza, asking, and she nodded, her fingers pressed to her lips, and he laid his hand very gently upon his son's dark head. You are Jory, he said. I am told you go in mended coats and never complain of it, and that you can name every king of England backward, and that you were not afraid tonight in a room full of people who wished you gone. I think you are the bravest gentleman I have met, and I have met a great many who were only pretending. I should like, if your mother will have it, and if in time you will have it, to be your father in more than the blood, for I am that already, and have been these 7 years, and was too poor a man to know it. Will you think on it? The boy considered him with the frightful gravity of the very young, weighing him as a magistrate might. You are cold, he pronounced at last. You should come in, and he put his small mended cuffed hand into the Duke of Atherhall's, and that of everything that terrible and blessed night was the thing that finished Fenwick entirely, so that he had to bow his head over the child's hand a moment before he could rise. He rose with the boy's hand in his one and the mother's in his other, and he turned them both toward the blazing house, and he did not lead them round to some side stair to spare her the company. He brought them up the great steps and through the west door and down the whole length of the gallery, past the shocked and shifting county, straight to the head of the room where Lucasta Trevithick stood white in her wedding lace with her diamonds gone dull at her throat, and her mother the Viscountess opening and shutting her painted fan upon a silence there was no filling. He stopped there, in the full blaze, with Corenza on his arm and his son at his side, and he spoke so that the last footman by the far door should hear it. You came to my wedding, he said to the room, to see a low woman shamed. You shall carry home a better tale than that. This is Corenza, my wife, my only and my true wife, married to me before God 7 years since, put from my house upon a forgery, and never for 1 day less than the honestest heart in any hall in this county. This is Jory, my son, born in wedlock, the heir of Atherhall, whom I have wronged by not knowing him and mean to spend my life deserving. His eye went cold and final to the 2 women in the lace and the paint. As for those who bought the lie and dressed it, and set upon my own strong room this night to send my wife and my child to a gaol, the settlement is void, the banns are void, and you will be gone from this house before that candle burns another inch. And out of my sight and my county after. Pengaro, you sought a felon tonight. You will find your felons yonder, in the wedding lace, and I will swear to it in the morning before any bench you please. The magistrate bowed grim and relieved, a man glad to be on the right side of a thing at last. And Lucasta, who had ruled that gallery an hour before, gathered her ruined lace and went from without a word, for there was no word, and her mother's fan snapped shut and followed, and the leaning faces that had murmured so avidly at Carenza's ruin now looked at their own shoes. And old Bramwell, by the door, wept without shame into his steward's glove, and Fenwick went to him through the whole watching-room and took the old man's hand as he had taken his son's, and said only, 7 years, Bramwell. You carried it 7 years, and you set it down tonight when it cost you most. I will not forget it while I live. Which was all the old man wanted, and more than he had hoped, and he could not answer it all. They were married again in the spring, in the little chapel where she had once been summoned to be shamed, with no county leaning to watch and no diamonds and no lace, only Jory Grave in a coat that for once had never been mended, and Bramwell restored to the head of the household. And the orchard beyond the chapel window coming into blossom the way it had come into blossom the year a girl of 17 copied out verses there for a solemn young man and laughed at his gravity. Fenwick had that orchard open to her window on purpose. He had learned, in a hard school, to leave nothing tender unsaid or unshown. There was a picture the household came to know that year and for many years after, and old Bramwell, who lived to a great age in the warmth of that house, would tell of it to the younger servants when the fire was low. Of a duke who had been feared the length of 3 counties, a man of one flat cold syllable, discovered of an evening in the long gallery beneath the eyes of his painted blood, not cold now and not flat, with a plain-faced duchess in a grey gown he would not let her give up. Though he had filled her presses with silk, tucked under his arm upon the window-seat, and a dark-headed boy sprawled across both their laps with a book of the kings of England, and the 3 of them so lost in one another that a man might cross the whole blazing room and go unnoticed. He had gone out once, Bramwell would say, to a cold terrace to be rid of his heart, and had come back in and given it away entire, and never once in all the years after did any soul see him wish it back. For the woman the whole county had come to laugh at had walked into that house with a secret that undid its master before them all, that he had been loved, faithfully and without price, through the very worst of himself, and he spent the long remainder of his days making it plain. In every small unfailing way a devoted man can, that of all the fortunes of Otherhall it was the only one he counted worth the keeping.